Hello, my name is Harold Lapidus, and welcome to the Boston Herald video podcast. I have two very special guests today. On the top row there is Michael Gray, and on the bottom row there is Ray Padgett. They both have written some very important books on Bob Dylan, in my not so humble opinion. And they're I'm going to give a little bit of a I'm going to talk first and give a little summary of what I know about each of them. Ray Padgett, I just found out about him one day on Twitter. Someone just said, if you like Bob Dylan, you should subscribe to his Substack. And I did, and I've been reading it pretty religiously ever since, except the last month when I've been busy seeing Bob Dylan, and I have to do some catching up. But a lot of his things that he wrote are in his book called Pledging My Time, Conversations with Bob Dylan Band Members. I'll read the little bio that came with it. Ray Padgett writes the Substack newsletter, Flagging Down the Double E's. That's what I was talking about Bob Dylan in concert. He is the founder of the cover songs blog Cover Me and author of two previous books, Cover Me, The Stories Behind the Greatest Cover Songs of All Time, and the 33 and a Third series, I'm Your Fan, The Songs of Leonard Cohen. And his writing has appeared in the New Yorker, Spin, Vice, and Mojo. And he lives in Burlington, Vermont, with his wife, daughter, and two dogs. And we've crossed paths a handful of times at a Bruce Springsteen concert, at a Bob Dylan concert, and in Tulsa a couple times. And Michael Gray, I've been reading his stuff for 4 decades or more.
50 years.
I the 70s, that's 50s, right? No, I was in the 81. So I was in England in 1981, and I just saw this book in a little shop. I didn't have a lot of money, but I said, this looks cool. And it's got a lot of kind of, again, a bunch of pictures. And I said, I didn't know what I was getting into. I bought it, and it changed my entire perception of Bob Dylan. Up in the 70s, I got to see him a few times, with the band and Rolling Thunder. But by the time I got the book, I kind of lost the plot. And that book helped me do a deep dive into where his music was at. And
well, at the time when that came out, he just was just sort of coming towards the end of his Born Again phase. So it wasn't the most fashionable time to be bringing out a book on Bob Dylan. Neither was it the very first time I did it, which was in 1972 and 73, when he hadn't done anything for a long time. And the last thing he really had done had been Self-Portrait, which had, again, not been his most groovy career phase. So, my timing has not always been great, but
neither is Bob sometimes. So. So when I read the book, I probably wouldn't be talking to either of you if I hadn't read the book. It totally opened my mind. One particular thing that I like to mention is, not only did you say some nice things about Self-Portrait, but Street Legal, which baffled me. At the time, you called it the second best Dylan book of the 70s. And then when I came back to America, I listened to it almost every day for a year. I just loved it. I just unlocked it in something in me. And then at the end of the 90s, you put out this version of the book, much over 900 pages, and it is now being reissued thanks to Craig Danielov at FM Dylan Freak Music, Dylan.pod, whatever it's called. And there's on his podcast, there's a very extensive interview series with Michael explaining and exploring a lot of stuff there. And I would
it's in 3 volumes this time, because Craig Danielov said people have a shorter attention span these days. So the 900-page version is, well, anyway, you have to be careful when you're walking around with it. Yeah,
that was the version I had. That was the one that was out when I was getting into Dylan in the 2000s. Was that the one Harold just held up, the giant one?
Well, I did spend almost the whole of the 1990s researching and writing that book. And good 90-something% of that was before I had the internet. So when I look back at it now, I'm quite impressed with the research. But there we are.
That's one of the things I wanted to get into. Well, why don't you start with Ray and what it took for him to write the book? I mean, he had the word processor, I'm sure, and well, who knows? But I don't know how old schooled you are. But I guess start with the wherever you want to start. But you have the newsletter, and that led to the book. And
yeah, so the newsletter started one of these pandemic sort of projects. I started it in early 2020, had a lot of time on my hands. The idea behind the newsletter was, and still is, just writing about Bob Dylan concerts. But at first I wasn't planning on interviewing anyone. It was just sort of writing about bootlegs I liked, which I still do. But early on, the real origin story is I was listening to one bootleg I was going to write about, which was a show in New Orleans in 2003. And as I was listening to it, I was like, there's a very prominent saxophone on pretty much every track. And I know that Bob Dylan in 2003 does not have a saxophone player in his touring band. So I go to Olaf's site, of course, and I look up who is this guy? It's this guy named Dickie Landry, like a jazz sax player who's played with Philip Glass a bunch, but only played with Dylan for that one show. When I Google him, his website comes up. I shoot him an email because, I've interviewed musicians for my other books and stuff. So I was like, I don't know, maybe there's a story there. He gets on the phone. It's this amazing story of how they met at this restaurant. And when Bob saw him, he's like, I don't know you. And he almost left. And Tony Garnier says this long whole thing. They never met before. They never met since. I ran it in the newsletter and people loved it. I was like, this is like really nerdy stuff. I mean, it is really nerdy stuff, but like literally this is a guy who only knew Bob Dylan for 24 hours, only played with him once. But it was a great story. And so that sort of opened the door to maybe I should do more of these interviews. And from there, I did some more for the newsletter. And then eventually I started thinking if I do enough of these, maybe there's a book. And that's the book.
And so, Michael, as not only was it before the internet, it was before personal computers and everything when you were writing the first version and maybe the second version of the book.
Yeah, it was. I had a typewriter, an Olympia moniker. Yeah. What I wanted to ask you, Ray, was how did you find all these musicians' contact details? Because when I was doing the encyclopedia, I found that in some cases it was really easy, like Winston Watson and a number of people. But you have honed in on more or less everyone, and that. How did you manage that?
Yeah, you're right. Some of them, like Winston, and like the example I just gave, I Googled the guy. He had a website, right? That was an easy one. Some of them have websites, but a lot of them do not have websites. A lot of them are people who are, session musicians or sort of behind the scenes people. There's no reason they would have a Facebook page or anything else. So a lot of those came from one person who I would interview, passing me on to another person. Like I think Jim Keltner, I interviewed him, and then we were chatting and he was like, you should interview Ben Montench and here's his email, or maybe it went the other way. But that sort of thing happened a lot because in many cases I couldn't find their contact info, but sort of word of mouth through the musician networks doing enough of these opened up a lot of doors for me.
And so, Michael, did you have like a carbon copies of, or did you go to a copier and make, hundreds of pages of copies at the local copy shop, or how did you get from typing at your typewriter and getting into book form?
I think I kept carbon copies, although that does sound a little on the old-fashioned side, even for me. I can't remember really how that came about, but you get to a point where you send it to the publisher, and then they produce copies on their printer, and I mean, a lot of stuff I have offloaded, a lot of the original material, a telegram from my original editor at the first publishing company, telling me I had to contact him within, the next 4 hours or something. A telegram. I mean, really, But I sold a collection of my papers to the University of Minnesota, to one of the libraries there. In fact, it was the person I was dealing with there was Greil Marcus's daughter. Yeah, that's quite a long time ago. Nowadays, yeah, it's just on the computer, of course, and it's a desktop computer. It's a very elderly iMac, mini Mac, in fact, but I have a very nice large screen, and that's how I work. I don't understand how people can just function with a phone. I just don't see that. But anyway, this is not particularly core to our purpose here.
All right. So, I'd say we'll be getting to some areas hopefully that haven't been covered before, but they're just to get the ball rolling. Ray, did you want to talk about how you got into Dylan and like your first concert experience?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned when talking about Michael's book, it was in the 2000s. It sort of half started. My dad had some old vinyl records I listened to, and I wouldn't say I loved them or even really understood them, but I was kind of vaguely interested. Enough so that I saw an ad, probably in the newspaper, that Dylan was coming to town. This was in Chicago. I was in high school in 2004. I sort of coerced my dad, who had been a Dylan fan in the 60s, but basically hadn't followed him ever since, to buying us tickets. We went. The show is the Aragon Ballroom. And I'd like to say, like, I got it in the moment, but I'm still not sure I did. But I was fascinated by it because I had seen maybe 6 months before Simon and Garfunkel. My friend's mom took my friend and I to one of their many reunion tours. And it was exactly what you would expect. They played Sound of Silence as close as they possibly could to the version and the boxer, and it was nothing but hits, and everyone's singing along, hold your lighters up. That's what I was expecting the Bob Dylan show to be, right? Strap on the acoustic, play Blowing in the Wind.
Can I just ask you, were you in a seat at this first concert, or was it one of those standing at the front, pressing up against hundreds of other people things?
It was standing room. This was an interesting tour. Right. I learned later, I didn't know this at the time, but where he did 5 nights in Chicago, all at different venues, I think all like standing room clubs. So yeah, the whole vibe was different. And of course, anyone watching this knows it was not like the Simon and Garfunkel show. I didn't recognize a single song, including the ones I knew. I didn't realize he had played them until after the fact. But I was like intrigued enough by it that I went and I downloaded the songs off of Napster. This puts it in the air. This is the Napster era. Not the bootleg. I didn't know people would tape such a thing. I just mean the original songs, the original versions of the 12 or 15 songs he had played. And I listened to that playlist on Winamp over and over and over again. And that sort of is what really got me into Dylan, is trying to figure out, again, the classic lines, something is happening here. And I didn't really know what it was, but I could tell that like something was going on and I wanted to learn more. And that's kind of what got me into it.
That's a nice way. That's a nice way for it to happen.
Yeah.
So Michael, for you, you got to actually see Dylan in the 60s. How did you get in? How did he come into your world back in England?
I became a student at the University of York in 1964. And the 60s were just beginning to explode. So it was a fantastic time to be a young student. And I was studying English and history. And one of the English students that I got to know was a girl called Linda. And I was interested in her. And therefore I was interested when she told me that there was this guy who was on a whole other level from Elvis Presley. Well, of course, by the time we were talking about this in late 64, Elvis Presley hadn't done anything interesting for years either. But I still had a kind of loyalty to all those old original rock and rollers, Little Richard, Cliff Richard, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis. And the idea that there was someone on a whole higher level than Elvis Presley seemed fairly shocking to me at that moment. But she said, no, this is a young guy called Bob Dylan. He writes his own songs. He doesn't just sing, and I'll lend you an album. And she lent me his newest album, which at the time was Another Side Of. And at that time, there were other students lounging around in the junior common room, complaining that Bob Dylan was selling out because this album was full of stuff that wasn't protest material. Well, that didn't bother me at all. I was used to rock and roll. I didn't want solemn folk song type stuff at all because I knew nothing about that. I'd never been to a folk club. Anyway, I found his voice rather difficult at first because, well, he's not like other people. And then it just occurred to me one time, I don't know by that time whether I still had some hopes of a relationship of a different sort with Linda, but anyway, at some point it just occurred to me that actually this voice was the most extraordinary, nuanced and variable instrument, just the most great instrument to express things and to express them so directly, without it seeming like I'm the performer and you're the audience and there's a nice professional gulf between us. It didn't seem like that. He just seemed to be talking so immediately and directly to the listener. And so, yeah, I was sold on him.
And
Yeah.
so you saw him in Liverpool in 1966 at the Odeon, right?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Now, I have so many questions about that, but do you remember like how you got tickets, where you were sitting, the crowd, the sound, all that sort of stuff?
I remember it was almost too late when I found out it was happening, because of course, there were no networks then and no newsletters, nothing. But the tickets were, I think they were quite cheap. I mean, I think they were 7 and 6pence, which means nothing, of course, now. But to give you a guide, it was about half the price of an album. Well, very different situation these days. Anyway, I got tickets and I went with my girlfriend Gillian, and it was just amazing because he was singing in the acoustic harp. He was singing things like Visions of Johanna, and you'd never heard it before. The album wasn't out in May '66 in the UK. There was no such thing as an international release date, a worldwide release date, and things were released in the UK rather later than in the States usually. So you hadn't heard that song. You had never heard a song like it. It was just extraordinary, and his voice was completely mesmerizing, and the harmonica was just divine in those concerts. It was so exploratory, and it was such a, I don't know that I recognized this at the time, but it was such a kind of odd mix of a kind of folky guitar, folky harmonica, with this sort of reinvention of what a harmonica, what noises it could make. So yeah, so it wasn't just the electric half that was extraordinary to me; it was the acoustic half as well. But
were you plugged in enough at that point that you would have known that there was a band, or were you surprised, do you think, when halfway through a band comes out?
No, I knew that was what was happening. I didn't know how I knew. I don't know now how I knew, but yeah, I knew that. And of course, this was Liverpool, which had been the center of the music universe because of the Beatles and other Merseybeat groups, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes and
Freddie and the
Big
Dreamers.
Yeah. And so what was partly astonishing about Bob's electric harp was, first of all, the sheer volume of it. I mean, it's so nice to hear the recordings because it's all clear. It wasn't clear at the time. It was far too loud to be clear. It was distorted and, not very well balanced. You could hear his voice sort of cawing above a morass of sound, but, it was, I guess you could tell which song he was singing, but yeah, it was just also the music. I meant to say it was infinitely more radical, complex rock music than anything that had come out of Merseybeat. And this was, from a guy who had been playing with a band at all for less than a year. Yeah, amazing.
I know Ray some other interview Ray told the story about the encore of his, I can't remember what the other, something like Rolling Stone, Along the Watchtower, whatever it is, and Cats in the Well, and and at the time he figured, well, Cats in the Well must have been up there with like a Rolling Stone because it was the encore. Because
yeah, like a three equally widely beloved songs: Watchtower, Rolling Stone, and Cats in the Well. I mean, that's, again, I was stuck in that sort of oldies act mode of that's what you put in the encore, right? You put the songs everyone wants to hear, so that's got to be one of them. Took me a while to figure out that one of these things was not like the other.
And all right, so let's talk about the Bob Dylan Center. Both of you have been there. I bumped into Ray a couple of times there. We shared a panel. You had some sort of presentation there or something, right? You were there, or did that happen yet? Have you been? There was something with you at the Bob Dylan Center, wasn't there, Ray?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I did. It was a virtual thing. I didn't go back to Tulsa. Yeah, I did a virtual book. They invited me kindly to do like a virtual book talk. That was a month or two ago.
But so we were on a symposium on the same panel together about collaborations. He talked about the collaborations in his book, previewing. I was proud to be the second person to ever buy the book. He signed it for me. And so what was your impression of the whole Switchyard? That's what it was called this year. The Switchyard panels and the whole shebang. What was your thoughts, Ray?
I loved it. I mean, I'm not an academic. I've never been to an academic conference. I don't expect to ever be to one that doesn't involve Bob Dylan. So I don't have that point of comparison. Like, a lot of the people are academics and they're comparing it to their other conferences. I mean, the thing I liked was just an excuse for a bunch of Bob Dylan fans and experts to gather in one place. Like, everything, the panels were interesting. The sort of programming was interesting. But really what I took away from that was all the non-panels, the non-events, that just getting coffee or eating bagels or running people into the hotel lobby or out and about in Tulsa, and just like a weekend of talking nothing but Bob Dylan is a blast. So yeah, I thought in that any excuse really to get all these people from all over the country together to talk about Bob Dylan, I'll take.
And the center itself, did you explore it both times or just last year?
I went both times. I mean, the opening, when we were at that opening, that's when I really spent hours and hours in it. I had my family there, as you know, the second time for the Switchyard. So I took them, and so that was fun. But with a 3-year-old, you're not exactly going to spend 5 hours in any museum. Although it's funny what bring a 3-year-old, who, by the way, she knows who Bob Dylan is and she can recognize him. So she's like, Bob. But of course, her attention lingers. But like, it's funny, the center, all the things that the little pieces that I would ignore, like for instance, there's a wall that you can just, like a chalkboard wall that you can just write whatever you want to write on it.
Yeah.
I don't care. Why would I have anything to do with that? Of course, if you're a 3-year-old, someone gives you chalk and a wall to write on. She's just doing that while I'm listening to, World Gone Wrong outtakes. And so there's, I was like, all right, good. There, it turns out there is something for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael, you did a presentation that was in person, right? When you went?
Yes.
And
yeah,
so
that was on the 10th of May this year. Yeah, it's the first time I'd been to Tulsa, although not the first time I'd passed through Oklahoma. Yeah, I was there 5 days in the end, because I mean, not in the center, but in the hotel in order to do this presentation. And that was just because of when flights were reasonably priced and how the logistics of the travel worked out. So it gave me a chance to look at what they called the Tulsa Arts District. Well, that took about 20 minutes. I mean, it's a very small block, couple of blocks in each direction.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the most important things on it are the Woody Guthrie Center and the Bob Dylan Center. I think every time I was in the center, it was when it was closed to the public, and so it was just perfect from the point of view of having as much time as you want in front of everything you want to look at. And I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was brilliantly organized, thought out, so resourceful and genuinely catering to genuine interest, rather than in any kind of way a solemn, deifying attempt at a museum. Yeah.
I guess they're careful. Like they that's why they call it the center as opposed to the Bob Dylan Museum, to get it away from that kind of mindset.
Yeah.
So right, what you said before about the kids, I guess probably most people's favorite thing that you wrote about was Winston Watson and his daughter at the Bob Dylan at a Bob Dylan show when Winston was obviously the drummer. I can link to that. But can you give just for those who are not familiar with what you've done so far, can you sort of retell that story?
Yeah, I'll give the Cliff Notes version. So Winston Watson, of course, the drummer in the 90s, fairly young guy, especially compared to a lot of Bob Dylan band members. So he had a young daughter, a few years older than mine. I think she was like 5 or 6 or something. And, when she wasn't in school or whatever, she and his wife would come on the road. And he said, she loved Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan seemed to really like hanging out with her. And I've heard this from a few people, that he seems to like kids. And the obvious theory is they're the only people who don't treat him like Bob Dylan, which I think makes a lot of sense. So one day before a show, Winston, his wife says, we can't find our daughter. The whole crew, the band, everyone is just combing the backstage area looking for Marcella. Can't find her anywhere. Finally, the one place they didn't want to bother, Bob Dylan's dressing room. They knock, an assistant opens it, and there's Marcella and Bob, and Marcella's in the middle of some long story about something or other, and Winston sort of shoos her out and says, sorry, we got to get on stage. You're holding up the show. So right before then, they're next to the stage, about to walk on, and Bob stops Winston with his hand, and he says, we got to do something about that girl. Winston, of course, assumes he means his daughter. And he starts, I'm really sorry. I know she was bothering you. I'll try to keep her separate in a different place. And Bob's like, no. It turns out that Marcella had been telling Bob this long story about basically a bully, a girl who was bullying her in class. The girl had splashed paint on her nice cowboy boots. Bob had asked, why do you have paint on your cowboy boots? Marcella tells this long story. So then afterwards, Bob comes up to Winston, referring to the bully, and says, we got to do something about that girl.
Very nice.
Yeah, there's I'll again, the blog that goes with this, I'm gonna link some of the you have a lot of video clips, audio clips from the interviews.
That actually came, Harold, that came from our presentation in Tulsa, which you saw. But I sort of didn't realize how quickly 15 minutes goes. So I'm like, I'll play some clips from my interviews. And I, found all these great audio clips and I put them together. And I was like, once you add in me talking, this is like a 2-hour presentation. So I ended up with all these random audio clips from the interviews that I couldn't use for the original purpose. So that's why I've just put them on YouTube, because I was like, I already did all this work. I'm with them.
Also, someone told, what was the joke I always tell people? It's like that someone telling, I don't remember who said it. I just remember one of the videos was, how does a train here with engineers?
Yeah, it was Ray Benson, the Sleep at the Wheel lead singer.
So I want to discuss some recent Bob activity and get your take on it. First of all, what did you guys each think about Shadow Kingdom, the video and the audio? Let's start with Michael.
Well, it disappointed me, not so much now, but at first, because what I really wanted Bob to do is the same as what I wanted him to do when he did Unplugged. I wanted him to come out, be real, stand there, play a guitar, and sing stuff. In the case of Unplugged, I wanted him to perform for MTV exactly what the sort of stuff that he had done on the 2 solo albums, Good As I've Been to You and World Gone Wrong, because they were his most recent work. Of course, I know perfectly well that it's only very recently that he's started focusing on his recent work. But at the time, that was what seemed to be interesting him, and it would have been riveting to see an Unplugged like that really was unplugged. Whereas what he did was, look unhappy, looking dressed as if he was trying to recreate 1966. It wasn't unplugged at all. It had an electric organ on it. And, the whole thing was just a bit below par. And it was, okay, I'll sing my greatest hits, which, is not Bob. And with Shadow Kingdom, I just thought it was a pity it was pre-recorded and that it was, this kind of phony film noir take on things. Just another sort of layer of barrier between him and an audience. But of course, that's not to say that it isn't extremely interesting in other ways. And the one that doesn't work at all, as far as I can see, is the one about the yellow moon being chicken.
Tombstone Blues. Yeah, I was going to get to that in a bit. Yeah, but
Tombstone Blues, it just doesn't work for me. It's the lyric is as immature as a Bob Dylan lyric gets, it seems to me. And it was written when he was young, and it works on the album, but it doesn't work at all, it seems to me, if you slow it down to make people pay close attention to every phrase in that way. The one that really did work, though, is What Was It You Wanted? I think that's fabulous on Shadow Kingdom, because on the Oh Mercy album, it's quite a sort of snarky, spiteful song. It's a kind of put down of the person he's addressing, or you can certainly hear it that way. Are you the same person who was here before? Who are you? What do you want? Kissing my cheek. Come on. It's very beautifully done on the album, but on Shadow Kingdom, it's a completely different atmosphere. And now on that one, it strikes me that he is this much older person, and it's not at all snarky. It's more, he's enacting a sort of confused person who is genuinely wondering are you the same person that was here before? And he delivers that so well, so well. I think that's the high point of Shadow Kingdom for me. I could have, done without all these people smoking and looking bored in the background and all that. Yeah.
Before I get, while you're on this, I'm going to get Ray's take. But what I thought was interesting about Tombstone Blues in particular, I know you were not a fan of the version. I know Rob Kelly of Pod Dylan was not a fan of the version. I know Craig Danieloff was not a fan of the version. It was interesting that Alison Rapp, who's writes for Ultimate Classic Rock, who's much younger, she liked it. She had a totally different perspective. I just thought it was just interesting that where you come in from, and your own personal experiences reflects what you think of it.
Of course, and I mean that that bumps us eventually into the thing that I get a lot of on social media, which is people saying, why are you down on this when it's just a matter of personal taste? And I think okay, but let's not reduce everything to personal taste. There are some standards, and Bob Dylan is the person of anyone in all this who set extremely high standards. And, I've always felt entitled to note when he falls below them, otherwise there's no point gushing equally about everything he's ever done. So yes, personal taste and a personal take on things. Of course, we can all take what we like, of course. I haven't heard what Alison Rapp says about that track.
And okay, Ray, so what'd you think of Shadow Kingdom? And more importantly, what'd you think of Tombstone Blues?
I actually, funny, while Michael was talking about it just now, I was like, what did I think of Tombstone Blues? And I quickly Googled, I right after, like the day after, I did a newsletter ranking all the songs. And Tombstone Blues was like right in the middle. So I don't think I have a strong opinion in either direction. But what struck me as interesting, seeing that again and listening to what Michael was saying, was that in terms of the worst to best Shadow Kingdom songs, I put What Was It You Wanted at number 2. So I pretty much agree with him, but I thought 1 was even better, and it actually echoed a lot of what Michael was just saying. And I thought that was Forever Young, which I think a lot of Dylan super fans, maybe super fans of any artist, anything that's like a greatest hit you've heard a million times, you're kind of inclined to roll your eyes a little bit. I don't think I would have said, I really hope he sings Forever Young at this, right? But hearing him sing it and watching him, and obviously it goes without saying, not a young man, and you can hear it in his voice and you can see it in the way he stands, and I found it so powerful and moving in a way that I never would have thought I ever would have found that song again. It's such a cliched sort of schmaltzy greatest hits the way most people do it, and so I found it really powerful. I definitely liked this sort of, I think what Michael called a barrier more than he did. I liked the sort of weird vibe about it. When he announced it, I found it a little bit ridiculous, because people think it's hard to remember the exact timing, but it did not happen like peak quarantine, peak pandemic. It happened when concerts were already back. People were playing shows. Live streams had died. Everyone had stopped doing them. And I was like, it's kind of like Bob Dylan's doing a live stream now. Like, where were you summer 2020 when when this really mattered and we were actually stuck at home? Why are you doing it now? Then of course we see it and realize it's not a live stream. He's not just, sitting in his house with a couple other guys. And so I'm a Tom Waits fan. And I found it very Tom Waitsy, the people smoking, the sort of noir prohibition weirdness. I really dug that. The part I didn't dig as much, and partly because I just felt like a fool, is afterwards I spent weeks beating the drum of, no, this was played live. I know the settings were weird, but not live at the time you're watching it, but the musicians on stage were the musicians playing. I was convinced of that, which, as we now know, was totally incorrect. It's totally different musicians in a studio somewhere else. So I felt like a little bit of a fool for being so convinced that was true. I mean, the reason I was convinced was that these are legit musicians on the stage. I knew Shahzad Ismaili a little bit because I'm a big kind of via the Tom Waits thing, actually. He plays with Mark Ribot, this amazing guitarist who often plays with Tom Waits. Shahzad plays with him. Shahzad's like this brilliant guitarist, bassist. I'm like, why would he just be like, you know, miming along to someone else's playing? I still don't know the answer to that, but that's why I was sure that these were the same musicians. So yeah, I still feel a little bit like I stepped in it on that one, but otherwise I like Shadow Kingdom.
Well, I can't say I've never been fooled by Bob Dylan about something, you know.
Yeah.
So but yeah, but again, you know, that so now getting back to Tombstone Blues as a song, one thing that I remember the first time I heard that, because I bought, after I saw Dylan in '74, soon after, I bought Highway 61. I knew some of the songs from greatest hits or live albums, but I didn't know, I didn't ever heard Desolation Row or Tombstone Blues or a lot of the songs. And I put it on, and it just, you know, my head exploded. You know, when I heard that guitar, it's like I'd never heard anything like it, and it's already almost 10 years old when I'd heard it. And so this is addressed to Michael, but you talk about you know, the silly lyrics, and you addressed this a little bit just now, but when you hear Dylan, obviously it's more than the lyrics, and when you and that particular version, you know, it's just mind blowing to me. But when you're thinking of all these things and all the way you analyze the music, how do you take it all into account? Like, you know, I don't want to misquote you. I think on one of the interviews you did recently, I think you referred to it as kind of a minor song, maybe. And maybe that's not what you said, but as a record, you know, and again, it's all opinion, but what is your take on that, maybe specifically, and then in general, as a recording, as opposed to just like Bob Dylan as an artist, as a songwriter, you know, performer?
I think I've slightly lost track of which version you're asking me about.
About the original, like when you, for instance, the original one from 1965. Yeah.
Oh well, yeah. I you know, well, when I write about these things, I'm not trying to separate the words from the music. I mean, I find, you know, I'm not a great musician. I can play a piano and up to a point, but not enough to be in a band. Mm-hmm. And I find music harder to write about than words. But you know, I never try to separate it so much that I am ignoring the feel or the any of the other things that come into it. I mean, the voice is as much instrument as deliverer of words, and the Highway 61 album, you know, it works perfectly as a track on that album. But I've never heard anyone say it was, you know, the track on the album that grabbed them the most. I mean, it may be for some people.
Well, Michael, you're about to hear someone say that, because when I was, again, this is before the concert I was talking about, my first concert. My dad had two albums, Love and Theft, which was the new one at the time. He had just gotten it because it was new, and Highway 61, which I think he had from back in the day. And that's the one. Tombstone Blues is the song I remember jumping out at me, which is not, I'm not going to make the argument that it's a better song than Rolling Stone, Desolation Row. Like, I sort of agree with you in the minor song. I mean, nothing on Highway 61 is a minor song, but like compared to some of the others, sure. But maybe another way to think of it is an entry level song. You know, if you're someone who doesn't know anything, Desolation Row is like way over your head. There's no way I'm going to figure out Desolation Row. It's 1,000,000 minutes long. It's just acoustic guitar. I don't understand any of the, like, forget it. I don't know anything. I'm not going to get Desolation Row. Tombstone Blues, tapping my feet. Like, I did kind of get it. That was the one that jumped out at me way back when, which I think is kind of interesting, because it's not one of my, that's one of my top 5 favorite songs now or anything. I don't even think of it that much, frankly. But at the time, listening to it for the first time, I remember being like, oh, this is pretty good.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Remind me how old you were at the time.
Probably early high school. So maybe, I don't know, 14, 15, maybe.
You encountered him at a younger age than I did. That's nice. Yeah.
15 too is when I saw Dylan and the band, and that's when my life went like the trajectory of my musical taste went a whole different direction. I saw Emerson, Lake and Palmer the months before, and it was nothing like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Rough and Rowdy Ways. Well, first of all, one thing that just popped into my mind when Ray and I both saw the same show in Springfield, Massachusetts on the last month or this month. What month is it? This month. And we both had seats up on the side, and we could actually see Bob Dylan playing piano. And it was usually I try to get in front, on the side so I can see him. But that particular
and Ray, you wrote I guess it was written. I think I read it rather than heard it, but you wrote really interestingly about how you fixed on his hands on the piano, and how although he appears to play this very up and down the keyboard stuff, actually you said his hands stay pretty tightly like two claws or something.
Yeah, that was the same show I saw Harold at. Yeah, it was interesting because his piano playing, I think, has taken huge strides in the last year or so. But you watch it, and like I'm not a good pianist, but I can play chords. And you think of a chord, the 1, 4, and the 5, and you kind of, your fingers are spread out, right? That's just like piano playing 101. His fingers are never spread out. The pinky's never going anywhere. They're all like right next to each other. And so it was just fun. So he's doing little twiddly bits with, notes next to each other, and he's zooming them out and about. But it was just, as Harold said, it was a fascinating view. Like afterwards, people were like, what did his voice sound like? I'm like, I barely was listening to his singing. I was so focused on this unusual view of his piano playing.
Well, when I saw him, it was in June, and it was in San Sebastian in Spain. And I was up at one side, but actually it wasn't a great show for me because the sound up there was far from properly balanced. People who had more expensive seats than mine down at the front said the whole thing was perfect, but not for me. And also, I was thinking, yes, I'm going to be up where I can really look down on him at the piano. But the stage, the lighting was so dim. It was so dark, and I was so far away. It was ridiculous, Sometimes I couldn't even see whether what I was looking at was Bob or just a kind of shadow somewhere around the piano. So yeah, I wish I'd seen more of those concerts, particularly the American ones, where he seems to have been more generous with the audience than he had generally been in Europe. I was interested, though, Ray, in what you said about his piano playing coming on by leaps and bounds, because I just wondered how you felt about the piano playing as it used to be, like when you hear it for the first time, really, on another side of Bob Dylan, not counting outtakes, I know there's a version of When the Ship Comes In where he plods away on the piano, but on things like Black Crow Blues on the 4th album, and then there's footage of him backstage during Don't Look Back where he's playing the piano and working stuff out, and I'll Keep It With Mine is another one. I absolutely loved his piano playing back then because it was utterly unlike anyone else's. And I wonder how you feel about that style that he had, and whether the downside of more current piano is just that it's not so uniquely unlike everyone else who's ever played a piano like it was then.
I mean, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, he's been playing piano for longer than he's been playing guitar. And he was great and still is, piano wise, another one like some of the gospel stuff, I think that started pressing on. He would start on piano. But once he switched over in like 2003, maybe it's just self limitations or whatever, but it did seem very sort of plonk, plonk, plonk. He said for a few years he switched to the organ setting, which sounded like a circus organ. He's like singing, Hollis Brown or North Country or something really beautiful, and then it's like nowhere.
Yeah.
So it maybe it's just that he's integrated it better into this sort of band sound, because I think as you say, back in the 60s he was playing this interesting piano. He's technically been able to do it the whole time. So why has he been doing this sort of plink plonk weirdness for recent years? In a way, I'm just thinking out loud here, but to some degree that's similar to his guitar playing, right? You think of the folk era, he's doing some amazing finger picking, just beautiful playing. Then you think of like the 90s, he's got this electric guitar and he's doing like the same 3-note solos for like 3 minutes at a time. And you're kind of like, I know you're a better guitar player than this. When he brings out the acoustic, he usually is. Or the folk records in the 90s, a lot of great playing on there. So somehow integrating what he wants to do with the band, that bit in Chronicles where he's talking about his, the rule of threes, that doesn't really make any sense, of how he plays the guitar, which doesn't seem to mean anything except play the same note a lot of times. Maybe he's trying to follow that in his piano playing sometimes. But yeah, it's kind of amazing that at 82, he's, into my ears, playing piano better than he has in at least the past 20 years.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I agree with Ray too. I think it was Michael, on the most recent Craig Danieloff interview. You were talking about, and you said this before, but love and theft is the only, I think, or is clearly the best thing from this century that Dylan has done as far as albums go. Rough and Rowdy Ways, I was intrigued by something you said, which was that it does seem very self-referential, or I saw Rough and Rowdy Ways in a way, it's an abstract kind of response to getting the Nobel Prize, like, talking about himself as this, and that he contains multitudes, and he does all all that type of thing. And I was wondering, it just got me thinking, and again, it's not, which is one of the things you do, is me thinking about how you thought it may have limited why it isn't as good, among other reasons, as Love and Theft, for instance. But is singing about yourself in that way, or being a boastful person, a negative thing, or is it just something that, like, you don't particularly like? Does that make sense? I had the same thing. It was weird hearing him talk about that he contains multitudes for the first time. It's like, and
well, I think what's slightly disappointing in that song is that it's just a little on the obvious side, and some of the lines I really squirm at. Those British bad boys, the Rolling Stones. Oh, come on, Bob, give it a break. I mean, really. But
doesn't Love and Theft have like, I'm stark naked, I'm hunting bear? I mean, this silly line.
Oh yeah, it has a lot of dad jokes on it. But there's no solemnity to that there, and basically I think Rough and Rowdy Ways, I like it a lot. I don't prefer some tracks to others, but I like it a lot, and especially I've made up my mind to give myself to you. That's fabulous. But on the whole, what I think is that now that he is so sort of consciously singing about his muse and linking it to all this ancient Greek, Roman god stuff, he used to just get on with having the muse. He didn't used to have to kind of sing about the fact that he's conscious of having it. and where it comes from. I mean, it just used to pour out of him. You know, he didn't need Calliope or any of these people. You know, it just came fizzing out of his young head. And there's just something a bit sort of pompous about now attributing it all to his timeless links back to the ancients. But I think it's a very strong album, and I'm really pleased that it exists, of course. But Love and Theft, yes, for me, is the only truly great 21st century album. And I mean, by that I just mean, does it stand up against Blood on the Tracks and Blonde on Blonde and Highway 61 and Freewheeling? Yes, it does. For me.
How about you, Ray? Rough and Rowdy Ways. I'm sure you've heard it by now.
I've heard of it. It's supposed to be good. I got to check it out. I mean, I loved it when it came out, but I think like a lot of Dylan's work and like a lot of Dylan's albums, it's really in the concert setting that it's blossomed. Michael mentioned Mother of Muses. I wasn't quite as down on the song as he is, but it wasn't a song I skipped to. It wasn't one I paid a whole lot of attention to. I kind of get the argument that singing about your muse is like a little cornball. But live, especially the last fall, it was like some of the most moving performances I'd seen. And especially when he was doing all the covers, I don't know if this was intentional, you never know with Bob, but it struck me that it was almost like, because he was doing them right before that song. It's like he's covering his muses, he's paying tribute to his muses, Merle Haggard, Jerry Garcia, Chicago Blues, whatever, right before he sings Mother of Muses. And so so like a song like that I would have called a lesser song on the album. In concert, it jumped out. And I'd say ditto for, in the 21st century, he's done a lot of mid-tempo blues songs, like a lot of mid-tempo blues songs. They kind of run together on the albums. Some of them are great. Some of them I'm like, ugh. And live, False Prophet, I didn't really care much about False Prophet one way or the other. Live, it just absolutely kicks. So, I'm like obviously a concert guy. That's sort of my focus. But I really think Rough and Rowdy Ways, the ways the songs have evolved, have brought even some of what I would have called the lesser songs to life.
That's interesting. I agree with you about Mother of Music's live, and I think you're absolutely spot on that those covers. It comes after each of those covers, and so that is part of what he's saying. His muses have been, and on the previous round of those concerts when he was in Britain, and he did one at Nottingham, which was the only arena concert of that tour, but it was when Jerry Lee Lewis had just died. And he said something at the end, I guess something about, I guess you heard that Jerry Lee has passed. And so then he sang this very obscure Jerry Lee Lewis track, which was called I Just Can't Seem to Say Goodbye. And when he sang that, it was so obviously the heartfelt thing that Bob Dylan is saying, he cannot stop this, he has to keep on doing this. I just can't seem to say goodbye. And it was just so touching. I wasn't there, I only heard it afterwards, but it was such a beautiful thing to choose, and such an obscure Jerry Lee Lewis track. And when you hear the Jerry Lee Lewis version, it sounds like a terrible song. And Bob brings it up to a whole other level. It's one of the best of those covers moments for me.
How you guys holding up? We've been talking for a while. Guys, good? Or you gotta
well, I can't linger much longer, I must say.
Okay, so I'll ask that. I'll talk about two more things. One is the Budokan, Complete Budokan 78 just came out. I know Michael saw Dylan in 78 and got to meet him. But first, ask Ray, who was probably not born yet. uh, what is as a as us old guys say, how did what was your first thoughts of Budokan when you heard it, and what do you think of the new album? I know you talked about your favorite things in it in your Substack thing, but what did you think about it when you came across it, and where in your studies did it come across?
Budokan came in my studies shockingly early. It was one of the first Bob Dylan albums I owned. And the reason was purely practical. I'm in high school. I'm on an allowance. I'm getting into Dylan, so I go to the CD store. And it's like, okay, Highway 61, that's got 10 tracks for 15 bucks. Budokan has like 30 tracks and it's like 20 bucks. Well, that's, more bang for your buck. So I got Budokan before almost anything just because it was so cheap and had so many songs on it. So like, I am pretty sure the canonical version in my mind of Don't Think Twice is like a reggae song. I'm like, oh, that's how it's supposed to sound, is this sort of light reggae thing. And oh, I guess Bob Dylan just loves flute solos. All his albums must be full of flute solos. So I have this sort of personal history with it where it was very early for me. I still love it. I've been defending it ever since. The box set I like because there's more of it. I certainly wish that it had included the entire year. I mean, the fall is so different than those first few shows. I've talked to a lot of the band members, and pretty much across the board, they say those were our worst shows. And they were our worst shows because they were like our first shows.
Yeah.
We played 100+ shows. The 100th was way better than these, which were like the 5th or 6th or something. So I wish they would do a proper bootleg series and include some of the US fall stuff. And of course, a lot more Street Legal. There's like Street Legal hadn't even been recorded yet. So they're not playing much of it live beyond the one song. So I like it fine for what it is, but I hope it doesn't preclude getting a proper 1978 bootleg series, Street Legal piano demos, outtakes. Like that's what I would really be looking for.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. And not just the full shows. I mean, the full shows in the States, in North America, were so far out there. But the European tour that he did after Budokan, those London shows, I went to all of those at Earl's Court, and they were exhilarating. They were wonderful. They're already on a whole other level from Budokan, and so were the shows I saw in Paris, and the one I went to in Rotterdam, which was an outdoor gig. They were marvelous, and you listen to some of the Paris things like
Hang a Love of Blue.
Anyway, just hearing any of that stuff, let alone the American ones, so much better than Budokan. And the audience, of course, in Japan is so polite that there's less atmosphere captured by the Budokan, complete Budokan anyway, it seems to me.
And do you want to just quickly tell your meeting Bob Dylan story, Michael?
You can find it somewhere else.
Okay.
I mean, basically, I was brought out to meet him with my son at the same time as people were being brought out in small groups, and Robert Shelton was one of the people being brought out when I was. And so, my mind is a blank about most of anything that I exchanged with Bob. The main thing I remember is that he said was about the songs. He said, to my surprise, he said, the old songs really do stand up, don't they? And I found myself thinking, well, it's not the old songs you want to worry about, Bob. It's things like Baby Stop Crying, It's not exactly on a par with Desolation Row, is it? So that surprised me that he could be kind of expressing any vulnerability about how his earlier work would be going down. Although, I mean, in a way, it shouldn't have been surprising in the context of what was happening right then, because it was absolutely the high point of punk. And Bob had long since, in London anyway, been cast as this hopeless old hippie from the 60s who how could he possibly have be of any interest? And yet, you had to queue all night around the block to get tickets, and the shows were scintillating, incredible. Yeah, I have an old cassette which I recorded of people I was with and me in the audience one night, and the sound is fairly lo-fi for the music, of course, but the sort of whoops and squeaks and of us in response to it are very atmospheric and telling of how thrilling it seemed at the time, and I haven't revised down my opinion of that at all. Yeah.
All right.
Can I just before I bow out of this, I want to ask. Well, I want to say something to Ray first, which is, I think your book is extraordinarily good because of how much research you had done before you talked to these people. It's perfectly clear in every case that you really know your stuff on each of these guys and where they were with Bob, and you pick out specific things that you note about particular concerts. And if you hadn't done that so well, if you hadn't researched it and been that keen to know it all so well, you wouldn't have got nearly such good stuff out of most of those people. And the material you got is a testament not just to them, but very much to you. It's a really good book.
Well, thank you. It would be an honor to hear anyone say that, but even more so, one of the great Dylan researchers of all time. So I'm touched. I appreciate it.
Well, I want to ask you one more question, which is, what kind of dogs do you have?
Now we're talking. Gonna have to add another hour. Mutts is the really short answer. We have one. They're both rescues. One is a hound mix from Alabama originally, and the other one is just a total question mark. He is a dog that my wife and I, maybe 5 years ago, did Christmas in South America, in Colombia, and there were just street dogs everywhere. And we found one that, I mean, he looked, first we thought he was dead. Then we realized he wasn't dead, but he looked like he was almost dead. We were not intending to adopt him. We just took him to a vet to either fix him up or honestly put him out of his misery. Well, It turned out they kept him for a few months. It didn't cost anything because, the exchange rate. And then after a few months, they did fix him up, and they kind of said, well, we could put him back on the street to end up in the same place, or ... question mark. And so he's been living with us for 4.5 years now.
Very nice. Yeah. I have one dog, and that is also a rescue dog, and it is partly a hound. It's half beagle and half Griffon Petit Basset de Vendéen. And luckily it looks more like that one than a beagle. In other words, it has quite long ears and shaggy hair and stuff. And there are a lot of them in need of rescue here in France, because the French people think that they're just kind of hunting animals, and therefore they only work in packs and they don't work as house dogs. But actually they're beautiful house dogs, hounds. They're intelligent, they're gentle, they're civilized, they're funny. And I feel lucky that we have the one we have. She's called Iris.
Mine. The hound is Annie, and the other one is Gabe. And yeah, our hound is always trying to herd us together. That's her main hound. Well, she smells a lot, but also her main hound thing is just if we're like walking on the sidewalk and me and my wife are too far apart or something, she's back and forth trying to, like a sheepdog almost, trying to get us closer together.
Okay.
All right. Well, just
have to go.
to say goodbye, just to remind everyone, this is the old version, but in 3 parts. The first 2 parts are out. I'll send links in where you can get it. This is Michael Gray's Song and Dance Man. It's divided into 3 parts. And the book that Michael was just praising by Ray, amazing stories. It's one of those things that it totally changes the way you think about Dylan in some ways, and then adds a lot more questions at the same time. But,
okay, well, thank you, Harold, and thank you, Ray, and goodbye for now.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
And
Thanks, guys. Great talking with you.
okay. Bye-bye.